what they were referring to. Maybe there's another way we should be part of that conversation, but in no way did they suggest we should eliminate minority rights in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you also referenced other jurisdictions. I want to remind the honourable member, who is a political science professor from St. Mary's, Mr. Speaker, that the federal government takes in revisions making sure that smaller provinces are protected. Mr. Speaker, there are 4 MPs out of Prince Edward Island. The entire province of Prince Edward Island is the size of some federal constituencies in Ontario. But the federal government's wisdom, setting boundaries commission, made sure they protected the cultural differences of Prince Edward Island, Mr. Speaker, and they did that by making sure that they have effective representation, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to go, and he also referenced the terms of reference that were set out by the committee that he was part of, that was chaired by the Minister of Justice. Well, the member from Argyll and I don't agree sometimes on issues of importance to this province. It is a far stretch to suggest that the member from Argyll and the member from Richmond ignored minority rights sitting in there, were prepared to get rid of the ridings of minority rights. He knows full well that when the member from Richmond, the member from Argyll, the member from Dartmouth East, and the member from Victoria Lakes were part of that committee, and they were talking about the variance of 25%, that was with the direct understanding that the minority ridings would be protected in the province of Nova Scotia, and that variance would apply to the other ridings across Nova Scotia. Right. There is no way any logical thinking person in the province of Nova Scotia would ever suggest that a member from the Acadian community would sit on that committee and say, no, go away, hey, do away with our rights. Right. Minority representation. How far afield is that? And that's why Nova Scotia can't have confidence in what's coming out of here when we stretch it to that point. Madam Speaker, I want to go back to the terms of reference that were set out. Madam Speaker, I want to go back to the terms of reference that were set out and the variation that was set in 2C.
Order, please. Thank you. I've heard an unparliamentary comment. I would ask the member from Yarmouth to retract that, please.
I will retract that comment, Madam Chair. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to go back now to where we began, and that was in November of 2011. The resolution was brought before this House. Madam Speaker, then this House appointed a committee, 2 members from our caucus, 2 members from the Conservative caucus, and 5 members from the governing party, to look at the terms of reference that would guide our commission that we were to set out. And I want to remind this House, by its own act, did not have to report to well into 2013. The commission only had to be appointed by December 31st, 2012. It did not have to report to the House, Madam Speaker. But what was important, and if you go back and look at the terms of reference that have been set out for every other commission, and it's talked about the deviation from parity of voting, Madam Speaker, and it talked about geography, it talked about communities' history and interest, and then it talked about the linguistic and cultural diversity, particularly in the province's Acadian and African Nova Scotian populations. Madam Speaker, those were the part of what had always guided the men and women who had accepted the invitation by this House to sit on the commissions to set our boundaries. But lo and behold, Madam Speaker, there's a new provision that was added, and added by the majority members who's members of the governing party in the province of Nova Scotia. And it says, notwithstanding 2C, which means all of the things that we were talking about just a few minutes ago, notwithstanding those, no constituency may deviate from a variance greater than 25%. So in essence, what they've said by this clause is the only thing that matters in the minds of the government was the number of voters in a particular riding. Communities of interest didn't matter. Linguistic and cultural diversity didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the sheer number of how many people each elected member of this House represents. So in essence, they wiped out the minority right protection that was in that every other commission had been in front of them. Madam Speaker, and I want to be very clear about that provision, because 2D was not supported by the Liberal caucus in any way, shape, or form. Nor do I believe it was supported by the Conservative caucus. It was pushed through by the members of the governing party in the province of Nova Scotia. So, With that in mind, we then asked Nova Scotians to join our commission and go out and engage the citizens, all of whom are honourable, hard-working Nova Scotians. Madam Speaker, and you know what? They are really the only truly group of Nova Scotians that went out and asked for their opinion from Nova Scotians. And they went out and they engaged them and they followed down what they thought were guidelines. Little did they know when they accepted the invitation that the only thing mattered was the number of voters. Communities of interest didn't matter. Linguistic and cultural diversity didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the number. And in essence, we really didn't even strike a commission. It's a mathematical formula. Just start carving up the population. That's what we're talking about. You could start at one end or the other, start moving the boundaries. But you know, the commission went out and it spoke to Nova Scotians. And it had a number of meetings from one end of Nova Scotia to the other. Mr. Speaker, I don't know if the member who spoke before me should listen to me. What he should do is actually read his own notes and figure out where he went wrong. Madam Speaker, so what happened was they went out and they engaged Nova Scotians and they listened to them. And you know what? They brought back a report. They brought back a report. While boundaries changed, while boundaries and constituencies across the province changed to a certain degree to deal with the variances, what they said very clearly is they heard from Nova Scotians from one end of this province to the other that the minority representation should be protected in the province of Nova Scotia, and their first recommendation to this House was to protect the minority ridings. I want to remind the members of this House, that commission went out and engaged Nova Scotians. They sat and they listened to what Nova Scotians had to tell them. And Nova Scotians responded very loudly. The minority rights should be protected in the province of Nova Scotia and should have representation in the House of Assembly, and should so be protected by the number of seats that are here. So what happened once that report was brought in? The Attorney General, acting on behalf of the Premier, rejected it and sent a message back to the Commission. You missed a clause. 2D. Nothing else matters but population. Focus on variance of 25% either way. So, what did the Commission do? It went out, again, talked to Nova Scotians, brought back a report. The report ended up coming in on July 20th. And what had happened? They delivered what the government wanted them to do, which was squash minority rights and squash minority representation in the House of Assembly. Madam Speaker, if you go back and look at what happened during that report, there were a number of interesting things that had come out. I know my riding changed. My riding went from, Madam Speaker, exactly where it should be on average, 13,800, down to 80.80, around 11,000 voters. I almost got taken out of my own riding. Some members do know what that's like. But I'll tell you what I did, Madam Speaker. I let my constituents know what it meant to them. I let the people of Annapolis Royal and Parker's Cove and Victoria Beach, Granville Ferry, Granville Centre, what it meant to them, where their representation would come from. I'm very proud of the way they responded. There was no electoral boundary meeting in my constituency until I, as their elected representative, reached out and told them the changes and the impact it would have on them. And they responded. And we then asked the Commission to hold a meeting in our constituency. And they did. I want to thank the Commission. They came and they listened. Madam Speaker, and on the July 20th boundary review, what did they do? They cut the community of Yarmouth in half. Pushed Argyll in part of it, Clare in the other. Well, through the great work of many people across that community, the community of Yarmouth responded. 2,500 people showed up to a public meeting. I'm trying to think when the last time we would have had 2,500 people at a public meeting in the province of Nova Scotia. Would have been a long time. So, Madam Speaker, that would have given some indication that what was recommended between Clare and Yarmouth was going to change. It had to, because of such an uproar. And let me be clear about the position of this caucus. We're perfectly happy and have been all along with the status quo. 52 members, minority rights being protected, allowing representation, change the variance if they like. Either way. But you know, when you look at what's taken place, and you look at the boundary meetings that had happened across southwestern Nova Scotia, I know the member from Lunenburg spoke, the member from Lunenburg West spoke, the member from Queens, the member from Shelburne didn't, the member from Argyll did, the member from Yarmouth did, the member from Clare did, the member from Digby Annapolis did, the member from Annapolis did. The only member who didn't speak was the Minister of Fisheries and the member from Shelburne. He didn't know it was coming. Well, if he didn't know it was coming, he obviously didn't read the report. Because the report clearly laid out direction number 2. And Madam Speaker, this is exactly what happens when you divide communities of interest and do not protect minority ridings in the province of Nova Scotia. By telling the community of Argyll and Clare, you do not deserve to have your representation in this House based on linguistic and cultural reasons, then you either tell the community of Yarmouth you're going to be cut in half, or you tell the community of Shelburne you're going to be cut in half. And that's what the NDP government did. And for the member from Shelburne to suggest he didn't know it was coming means he didn't read the report. It means he hasn't paid attention. That's all that means, Madam Speaker. You know, Madam Speaker, there's some suggestion there was a Liberal conspiracy to somehow divide the constituency of Shelburne. We've been very clear from the very beginning about protecting minority rights in the province of Nova Scotia. I was expecting over the weekend to hear that we found the grassy knoll in the second shooter after hearing the conspiracy about what we were supposed to have done. I can tell you, if I had any influence at all, any influence on that commission, the very first report they delivered to this House would have been the one I would have accepted. And what's even more insulting is that hard-working, honourable Nova Scotians who accepted the task put forward by this government go out and do their work. They engage Nova Scotians, and then they get attacked personally. The commissioner from Clare gets attacked personally by the Premier. Gets attacked personally by the Premier. What did he think an Acadian representative on the commission was going to do? Endorse the elimination of minority rights in the province of Scotia? Endorse the elimination of those protected ridings? What did he think was going to happen? And he somehow has confused that with partisan politics. If there's any partisan politics been put into this process, it comes directly from one government place. Madam Speaker, they've gone out and they've engaged and worked hard on behalf of all of us in this House to try to engage them, to have their own reputation to be spread across the newspaper, to be insulted by the government is offensive in any way you look at it. The member from Citadel Sable Island suggested he would encourage anyone, if they got an opportunity to sit on a select committee and commission.
He was just horsing around.
Well, Madam Speaker, you know what? That might be a good idea, except when government interferes with the process. The commission and its independence is what was at the heart of allowing us to build our independence and the boundaries and how we create the structure of this House. The independence of that committee was at the very heart of it. And it was when government interfered is when it made every Nova Scotian take heed and say, why would I participate in a process that is supposed to be protecting minority rights in the province of Nova Scotia, that is supposed to be giving representation to every community across this province, when the government's going to step in when I give a recommendation and overturn it? Madam Speaker, there's a final report that had come in on September 20th with many changes in it. We've heard we've heard about the conspiracy theory down in that somehow in southwestern Nova Scotia had taken place. Madam Speaker, that we're taking the Law Amendments Committee now to Shelburne. Well, Madam Speaker, I've had a chance to look, and I've asked the Attorney General, and I've written to the Attorney General to ask if he is taking law amendments to other communities that have been affected by the boundary changes, and I'm waiting to hear back from him. And particularly, as I know the member from Antigonish knows, that in the report that was delivered to this House on July 20th, or delivered to the government on July 20th, the constituency of Antigonish was unchanged, just like the riding of Shelburne was unchanged. In the final report, that boundary has changed. Members of that presently reside in the constituency of Antigonish and around the Harvey-Bushy area have been moved and go into the community, into the riding, which is in Guysborough Sheet Harbour riding, which has been renamed. That community hasn't had its chance to be heard. I want to know from the Attorney General, is he taking the Law Amendments Committee there so that they can have their voices heard? I'm looking forward to that. I know that the member from Antigonish, the Minister of Transportation, was at a meeting. If one member of that cabinet has law amendments arrive to defend their constituency when they weren't prepared to do it during the process, are we going to do it for the Minister of Transportation? We think we should. If we're going to do it, let's do it for everybody. While we're at it, let's take the law amendments to the minority ridings that are being eliminated altogether. Let's take law amendments to the Speaker's riding that's completely disappeared, riding of Nova. It's gone. Let's take law amendments down there so that we can hear from his constituents how they feel about a process that was clearly driven by the governing party. The whole issue of deviating 25% and eliminating minority rights was put in place by the governing party, not by the support of this caucus. They would like to try to suggest to all Nova Scotians that this was the support of the House. This committee had the endorsement of everyone in this House. That is not the case. Madam Speaker, just like in 2002, and subsequently to that in the early 1991-92 when they looked at boundaries, there was a resolution brought to this House. But the most important aspect of all of those was in the terms of reference. It's a little bit like, Madam Speaker, when we pass laws in this House and the regulations then get set by outside of this House. Sometimes change the very meaning of what was talked about and presented before us, because the regulation is the detail. And oftentimes, by the time the regulations are attached to a particular bill, they've changed. Well, that's what happened here. Members of this House supported a resolution that would strike a committee, select committee to go and look at boundary reviews. But it was in the terms of reference when things went sideways. It was not unanimously supported that Clause 2D go in there, regardless of what's being presented by the members opposite. It was not supported by this caucus or the Progressive Conservative caucus that Clause 2D and the only thing that matters is 25%. I had the opportunity to be in Shelburne with the Minister of Fisheries and the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party at a public meeting. And I highlight the very fact that when you take away the minority rights and the ridings that are being protected, it has to have an impact on neighboring communities, one way or another. There's roughly 7,000 people, Clare and Argyll ridings. They deserve to have representation. In our view, they deserve to have their own representation representing their cultural and linguistic uniqueness in our province. But in the eyes of government, that's not the case. So then what happens is, Madam Speaker, you then start splitting communities all the way up on both coasts. You know, it's of great interest to me when I listen to talking about the only thing, and it's been quite a debate across when I'm talking to some of my own constituents about this issue about equal representation and the idea that the only thing that matters is population. I noted with interest the previous speaker's riding of 14,800. My new riding is 16,194 in it. In 15 minutes, he can walk across his. My riding borders on Kings County. I touch Lunenburg County. I touch Digby County. And I would touch Queens County, except for the good community of Maitland Bridge is moved into riding of Queens. For logical reasons. Reasons I think the community endorsed. Now, is that equal, effective representation? How is it equal for someone who takes an hour to have to drive their constituency office to the MLA? When someone can walk 15 minutes across to see his, doesn't actually need transportation. When am I riding, you're not getting to the MLA's office unless you have transportation, if you happen to live in the, next to it. Is that equal? According to the government, that's what we're striving for. Look at the riding of Guysborough. Geographically, it is huge. Inverness. There's no question there are issues around depopulation in parts of rural Nova Scotia. That doesn't mean that the communities and the members who live in those communities do not deserve to have equal representation. And equality is not just based on the number of constituents an MLA serves in this House. Access to your elected representative should be part of that conversation. Madam Speaker, I'm looking forward to hearing from the Minister of Justice on when our caucus can prepare for the law amendments committees that are going to take place in Antigonish and in other communities across this province, because I think it's important. I'm pleased that the government has seen fit to move that committee to Shelburne. But if we're going to do that, then we need to go to every other community that has been affected by these changes. Madam Speaker, I want to kind of just finish up a little bit with my own my thoughts about where we are as a caucus, and I want to make this perfectly clear that at no time did this caucus in any way suggest that we should eliminate those minority ridings. We believe that Clare, Argyll, Richmond, and Preston should have been protected. Our caucus and the members of our caucus who sat on the committee putting together the terms of reference, when they began to talk about the 25% variance, was talking about the remaining ridings in the province of Nova Scotia for the very reasons that we've talked about. The issues that have been associated with geography, making sure that communities like Guysborough County can be represented without having to have a geographical mass the size of Prince Edward Island and having an MLA to represent it in order to capture the right number of people that seem to fit in the mathematical formula designed by this government. This whole process has undermined the confidence in many ways of the voter. It was interesting to me when I was listening to the first report that was delivered to this House on May 31st. I made comment myself in the Red Room and how pleased I was about the minority ridings being protected. But what was interesting to me was, as I traveled around, a lot of people were, those that were talking about it really in a positive way. There were some who obviously didn't feel that way, but the majority of people that I spoke to who were talking about this particular issue were encouraged by it. But I can tell you, when the Justice Minister sent his letter to the Chair on behalf of the Premier and the government, I heard about it. I heard about it from every corner of this province. I thought this was supposed to be independent. What is the Attorney General doing interfering in the process? If we've asked these hard-working Nova Scotians to go across our province and engage citizens about putting together a new electoral boundary structure, why aren't we letting them do their work? And the simple reason for that was because it didn't fit for the government. And the clause that they endorsed wholeheartedly, which was about nothing more than population. The only thing that caused a greater furor among voters that I've talked to was the way members of this commission were chastised by the Premier and the Attorney General publicly. No matter where, even people who said, you know what, we shouldn't protect minority ridings. They could not believe that the Premier of this province would treat a member of any commission the way our Premier treated the member of that commission from Clare. Sending out a very partisan attack on him. Attacking him for no other reason than he dare write a dissenting report. Interestingly enough, the Premier didn't attack the member of the commission in May who resigned. Why? Because she agreed with the Premier. So let that be the lesson. In the Premier's view of democracy, if you agree with him, you're okay. If you have a different point of view than he does, you get chastised in public. It's bad enough if any member of this House does it. It's bad enough if any member of this House does it to a citizen of the province. But when the Premier does it, what signal are we sending? Is he sending about his view of democracy in Nova Scotia? You know, it's a response we're starting to see from the Premier on a number of fronts. But when a citizen accepts the challenge that was presented to them by this House to go out and engage Nova Scotians, they should be treated with our respect and not be treated with the way they were by the Premier when it came to disagreeing with him. Each member of that committee, while there may be challenges associated with the boundaries and all of us, how they affect our individual ridings, expressed some of them and recommendations on how we thought they should deal with our ridings. Those of us that were paying attention did. At the end of the day, they made changes. They didn't do it with any malice intent to go get somebody. They didn't do it in any way to come and listen to anyone over that. What they listened to was not the 52 members of this House, while some of them took their right to present at commissions. They listened to Nova Scotians. And while I may not always agree with the members of that commission on a whole host of issues, I've never once questioned their integrity and their desire to make the province a better place. All of them have made extraordinary contributions to Nova Scotia in their own unique way. And by accepting the invitation by this House to sit on this commission, that's what they were trying to do, was to be an active citizen in the democracy, to help try to lay out guidelines and rules that would govern this place and who sits in it over a period of the next 10 years. They deserved more than to be chastised in public. They deserved our respect for doing so. Madam Speaker, I mentioned earlier about inviting them to my constituency of Annapolis. after they'd received a number of emails from people in and around Annapolis Royal and Parker's Cove and all communities across. And they engaged, they accepted, they came, they listened. The citizens of Annapolis Royal and surrounding area were very respectful. They laid out thoughtful ideas about how they believe this commission could work and what it should do to protect their community of interest. That the fact of the matter that Annapolis Royal's communities of interest was in eastern Annapolis County, not in Digby County. And they respectfully came and listened, and I must say, Madam Speaker, that the most common response I got from my constituents following that meeting before any changes had been made was they were appreciated the fact that the committee came and listened to them when they asked them to. And that's what we should be acknowledging and respecting from the men and women who agreed to sit on the Electoral Boundaries Commission. We should be thanking them for the work that they've done on behalf of Nova Scotians, not chastising them in public. The very health of this institution depends on the fact that Nova Scotians have the right to speak freely and openly without their premier chastising them in the paper. Madam Speaker, there's been much being said about what's taken place around the issues of the Boundary Commission. I want to finish up by reminding this House that nowhere in the resolution that was presented by the government or by the House of Assembly Act that says the boundary changes have to take place by December 31st, 2012. Nowhere. It's nowhere. It's made up in the mind of the minister, for the member from Citadel Sable Island. It's nowhere. What it says was this House has to strike a committee by that date. It doesn't say when the committee has to report to the House. Nowhere does it say when the committee has to report to the House. It just says that committee has to be struck by the date of December 31st, 2012. Nowhere. And I want to make it clear to this House that while this may be the third time we're reviewing them every 10 years, and the member spoke before me, Citadel Sable Island, kept making references to the resolutions that were passed by previous governments. Resolutions were the same, but what was not the same is the terms of reference. What they did in essence by inserting clause 2D was really take away the ability of an independent commission to respond to the thoughtfulness of Nova Scotians. This independent commission, as they thought they were, went out and listened to thoughtful Nova Scotians who made presentations in communities across this province. And the commission responded in the affirmative by protecting minority rights and making sure that they believed that the variance in other ridings was to the best of their ability met. In other words, they did exactly what every other commission has done because they listened and they weren't bound by clause 2D. In their mind, and I think if they read the original report that came in May 31st, 2012, if you read what they've said, they believed that those terms of reference were guidelines, just as every other commission has done in this province. Didn't say they had to protect the Acadian seats in 1992 or 2002. Didn't say they had to protect Preston. What it said was, it needs to be part of your thought process that Acadian and African Nova Scotians representation is protected in the House. And they gave the commission the flexibility to respond to what they were hearing from Nova Scotians. It was only this government, the NDP government of Nova Scotia, that inserted clause 2D, which in essence took away the independence of the commission and took away the flexibility of the commission to respond to linguistic and cultural uniquenesses of our province, to ensure that minority rights were going to be protected and be sitting in this House in the province of Nova Scotia. Clause 2D eliminates everything. And for the government to say that it wasn't brought up before is simply wrong. It's been talked about at every opportunity we could. Madam Speaker, what they in essence said is the mathematical formula will determine who sits in this House. So let's not fool ourselves. The structure of this House, the Boundary Commission, that's the report that was presented by the Boundary Commission, was orchestrated and delivered for this government. If there are communities that are upset that they've been cut in half, that they've been moved out of their communities of interest, they have no one else to blame or to look at but the NDP members of this House. No one else in this House supported eliminating and taking away the independence of the Boundaries Commission. No one, except for the members of the NDP caucus. So, Madam Speaker, I hope, as the Law Amendments Committee moves from one community to the other that's been affected by the decision made by the NDP caucus, that we get an opportunity to further debate this. We will, when it comes back. I know I'm looking forward to when the committee goes to Shelburne, looking forward to when the committee goes to Antigonish. We'll be there to support the Minister of Transportation when he asks for that. I believe, I don't want to speak for the members next to me, but we'll be there to support him. We'll be there to support any member of the House whose riding has been ill-affected, to make sure that the law amendment shows up in their community. Making sure that when we want them to arrive in Clare and Argyle and Richmond and Port Hawkesbury, Cape Breton Nova. We'll be there to support the independence of the Speaker. Since the Speaker's independence might be questioned, we'll be there to make sure that they go to Cape Breton Nova. Because as all of us know how proudly he speaks of his community that he represents. And he talks about the uniqueness of his community. You know what? Under the NDP rules of 25% variance either way, see you later. Doesn't fit into the mathematical formula, we carve it up. We put pieces here and there to take away representation. We will be there to support any member of the government party whose riding has been cut up and divided. We'll be there to help you get law amendments to your community, to make sure that your constituents are treated fairly, that they can express their views. That's what we're here for, to help any way we can. Madam Speaker, one thing we will not compromise on, though, nor could we ever support, is the elimination of the protection of minority rights in the province of Nova Scotia. Many of you have heard me speak of my mother in this House. My mother's from Richmond County. She's an Acadian, Mumberkit. Unfortunately, her language didn't get passed on to me. And I'm the poorer for it, quite frankly. And our community and our province would be poor for the fact if we do not enhance, improve the language rights in the province of Nova Scotia. There was talk about New Brunswick. New Brunswick is the only truly bilingual province in Canada. There was talk about the issues in and around their representation. They've enshrined language rights, making sure that people would be in that House, protecting them. What we have said, and we believe, that minority rights should be protected in the province of Nova Scotia. And any form of electoral boundary that does away with that will not be supported by this caucus or by this leader. Madam Speaker, I appreciate the opportunity to speak in this bill in second reading. I look forward to hearing from Nova Scotians as they tell us how the new electoral boundaries has impacted their individual communities and, quite frankly, their individual families. And I hope members of the governing party listen, because they haven't been listening. When the Electoral Boundaries Commission listened, they were told, sorry, go back to the drawing board. I hope they don't say that to Nova Scotians who take out the time to come and speak to law amendments in Shelburne and in Antigonish and in every spot in between that's been affected by these changes. It is important that they get a chance to express their views, and it's imperative for this House to pay attention to what Nova Scotians say. And when Nova Scotians say protect minority rights, this House should protect it, and the government of Nova Scotia should protect it. Madam Speaker, with those few words, I'll take my place.
Thank you. I now recognize the honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I wish I could say I was pleased to rise in my place to speak on Bill 94, but I think more than pleased, we're obliged to stand and speak on Bill 94. Over the years, Madam Speaker, Nova Scotians have come to appreciate how important boundaries are. We have the Bay of Fundy, the Missaquash River, the Northumberland Strait, and the Cabot Strait, all of which form Nova Scotia's natural boundaries. When we cross them, Madam Speaker, we enter other provinces, where things are done a little differently, but the people are very much like us. There are lines on a map that define communities, large and small, within our province. There are counties, districts, cities, towns, villages, or simply places. Sometimes the people on the other side of such a line are a little bit different in their history, or maybe just how they go about their business. But seldom does crossing such a boundary change us or create any problem because we get along. Mostly, those boundaries stay the same. Then, Mr. Speaker, there are constituency boundaries. They, too, are lines on a map. Crossing them brings you in contact with more Nova Scotians, which is a good thing. In spite of the fact that the people on the other side are not all that different, if at all, we've learned that people are often uncomfortable changing these lines. Why? Because it might change how things are done. Who will have enough say to protect their way of life, their language, their culture, or whether the change will mean that fewer resources will come their way? And finally, Mr. Speaker, there are legal and ethical boundaries. Sometimes they're written down, other times they're just understood. The people on the other side of such a boundary are very different. And when someone crosses such a boundary, it can have a deep impact on everybody. These boundaries are the difference between right and wrong, fair and unfair, balanced and out of balance. Blurring these lines weakens the bonds we have together as Nova Scotians and as Canadians. And when that happens, Mr. Speaker, none of the other boundaries matter. The main boundary we all must stay within to live in civil society is the rule of law. We make laws in this place on behalf of everyone. People are expected to follow them. There are consequences when that doesn't happen. Of all people, we must set the example and uphold our laws. Nobody is above that. Nobody should make the mistake of thinking they have all the right answers and feels that that justifies whatever they do. So it's ironic, Mr. Speaker, that when we try to change boundaries to do something, some people just end up crossing boundaries instead. If the shoe fits, Mr. Speaker. The boundaries between right and wrong in this situation are formed by 4 lines. First, the law, the House of Assembly Act, which created an independent commission to draw our boundaries so we as politicians are not tempted to cross other boundaries. Second, 20 years of practice that has made us a model of independent, fair, impartial boundary changes. Cross these precedents at your own peril. Third, what Nova Scotians expect of their elected representatives. They don't expect perfection, but they do expect we'll try to do what is right and that we will be fair and just, not seeking unfair advantages. And fourth, Mr. Speaker, common sense. The good judgment of all of us as Nova Scotians must prevail over self-interest, real or perceived, or petty concerns. Mr. Speaker, those 4 lines might form a square, but that doesn't matter if someone flips the lever and lets Jack spring from the box. And that's what's happened, Mr. Speaker. It didn't take much, and suddenly the government was outside the box and couldn't get back in. For the first time in the history of independent boundary setting in this province, we have a government wobbling and flopping around on top of a sprung spring. They think, Mr. Speaker, and this is the saddest part, that they're on a pedestal. But the reason they find themselves losing popularity faster than a guy who brings a skunk to a picnic is that they acted high-handedly at each turn. Every decision was made in their interest, but calculated not to look that way. First few times, didn't look too bad to too many, but on they went. And they still remain convinced they're right. Some history. First, we've had 2 independent commissions before. They were given clear terms of reference with cooperation from all 3 parties. The key decisions were made in the legislature in the light of day. We also have an elections commission where all 3 parties have representatives and where there's balance. In October of last year, Mr. Speaker, the NDP was considering what to do this time. They asked, thank you, and to give credit where due, we advised them to keep the same very thorough terms of reference that are a precedent that has served us well, which complies with the Supreme Court's judgment in Carter. Tried, tested, true, and not going to alarm people. Mr. Speaker, the NDP's response was on Halloween, and we're approaching that again now in just another couple of days, so isn't this ironic? Happy birthday to Boo. The NDP's response was on Halloween last year when they introduced a resolution creating a select committee. Pardon me, not unusual, with a mandate to travel and listen not unusual, and with a majority of government members, not unusual. But they also cropped the key terms of reference out of the resolution of the House and left important decisions to the NDP-dominated Select Committee. Highly unusual. You know, Mr. Speaker, the member from Sable Island, Citadel Sable Island, mentioned about trying to, I know in part of his talks he talked about Victoria County when he made reference to Victoria County, which is now Victoria the Lakes. The Leader of the Opposition earlier referred to the members that live within Metro that could walk in their constituency from one end to the other in about 15 minutes. Mr. Speaker, I feel that I should let the House know that in order for the member for Victoria the Lakes to travel from French Vale, Macadam Lake area, to Bay St. Lawrence takes 4 hours. So don't try to walk that one. The constituency of Victoria the Lakes, Mr. Speaker, is so large that I, as a member, or any member before me, could not expect people to come to my office. I don't think anyone should have to travel 2.5 hours to come to see me. I feel it's my obligation as their MLA to travel to see them. Now, again, within Metro, no problem if you want to, everybody can have their office within 15 minutes walking distance. And you can see as many people on a given day as you want. But members that are in large geographical areas within this province don't have that luxury. And the citizens of those same large geographical constituencies don't have the luxury either. You know, getting back to what we talked about in the setup of the committee, I've referenced the fact that the important decisions were left with a select committee that had 5 members of the government on. It also had 2 members from the Progressive Conservative Party and 2 members from the Liberal Party. Mr. Speaker, we raised concerns immediately. In principle, this was wrong. It meant that the NDP-dominated committee could, with very little scrutiny, make changes in the way Nova Scotians are represented. This was a hostile takeover of a non-partisan process. And Mr. Speaker, we objected. And we asked for balance on the committee, like the Election Commission, so no one has party, especially one like Bob Rae's government in Ontario. It had been elected but once, but it had the opportunity to set rules to its advantage for 10 years. Can you imagine, Mr. Speaker, what would happen? We had a chance to bring focus to the legislature, the focus of the legislature to this situation. But you know what, Mr. Speaker? And I know it's not going to be appreciated, but the party that labels itself the official opposition didn't want to oppose. They didn't want to do their jobs and shine light on a bad resolution. They wouldn't invest any energy. They went along with the NDP. And they clearly hadn't done their homework, because if they had, they should have realized that the other shoe would drop and the next phase of the NDP scheme would be worse. Mr. Speaker, I guess that's why they come up with energy policies that repeat the same expensive mistakes as the NDP of other provinces. Pick something that sounds good or take no position at all and wait your turn. And now the citizens of Shelburne, Argyll, Clare, Digby, Preston, Richmond, and industrial Cape Breton all lose out, as Yarmouth very nearly did, because the government made sure that the official opposition was asleep at the foot of the NDP's bed like an obedient little lapdog when rules were changed. People were asked, where were the Liberals when this was a real issue with real consequences for those Nova Scotians? Let me tell them through you, Mr. Speaker, we're happy being the unofficial opposition and getting the job done, hoping that we can do what we can to serve Nova Scotians. So we did what we could, Mr. Speaker, without any help, and here we are 1 year later, almost 2 days short, looking at the wreckage left by repeated NDP political interference of an independent process that should have the Minister of Transportation, the member from Chebucto, the member from Atlantic, the member from Fairview blushing if they read the law and see the word independent written in black and white. As for the Premier, nothing embarrasses him. Mr. Speaker, I realize that the hour is getting late, and I have much more to say on this topic, but for the time being, I will adjourn debate for discussion another day.
The question is for adjournment of debate on Bill number 94, House of Assembly Act. All those in favour say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that concludes the government's business for today. I wish you would now rise to meet from the hours of 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. tomorrow. And after the daily routine and question period, we will be doing public bills for second reading. We will do Bill 94, 97, and time permitting 102. I ask you to now rise, Mr. Speaker.
The question is now that we adjourn until tomorrow. All those in favour say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. We will now adjourn until tomorrow to sit between the hours of 2 p.m. and 6 p.m. Thank you. Thank you.